Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Knowledge Bank. Today's session is being presented by Abigail Blumzon, sorry for the pronunciation if that's incorrect, from Bailey Partnership, and she is going to be speaking to you about the golden thread in practice and how information management enables building safety. If you have any questions throughout the webinar today, please do put them in the Q&A box and we will try to get through as many as we can. The webinar is also being recorded today and will be available to watch back via the News on the Block YouTube channel for anyone that cannot join us live, or if you simply would just like to watch the webinar back for the information again. That is all from me. I am now going to hand you over to Abigail to begin the webinar.
Thank you so much, Vicky.
You're welcome.
So pleased to be here with you all. So the session is on the golden thread in practice, and the plan is to focus on kind of less on the theory of the golden thread. It's kind of a term that you'll all hear used so much, but more about what actually happens in practice, what you need to know on a day-to-day level. So in the industry we're all working in, we hear the term golden thread constantly. But in live projects, the challenge is generally much simpler, which is just, can you find reliable information quickly enough to actually make safe decisions on your projects? So my aim in this session is to reduce a bit of the abstraction around the golden thread and what that actually means, and talk about where projects sometimes fall down, what consultants and regulatory bodies are actually looking for on your projects, and then just what practical information management looks like on real buildings, real schemes that you are all working on. So in terms of who I am, thank you so much, Vicky, for the introduction. I'm Abigail. I'm a project manager by background, and I'm one of the directors at Bailey Partnership, who are a multidisciplinary construction consultancy. And a huge amount of our work as a business, and my work and my team's work personally, is working in occupied residential buildings, whether that's kind of day-to-day management activities like supporting with fire risk assessments and fire risk assessments for external walls, but also supporting things like remediation programs, where having this golden thread of information is so important to actually make sure that the right things happen at the right time. So my job basically means that I support things like gateway submissions, regulatory reviews, coordinating large multidisciplinary teams ranging from block managers, managing agents, building control bodies, fire risk assessors on schemes where information is so vital, and also managing safety critical information on projects. The main reason I wanted to deliver this talk is because I repeatedly see the same issues on projects that we work on, from fragmented information, changes happening in a way that isn't controlled, uncertainty over approvals, and uncertainty from block managers over what they need to actually do on a day-to-day level. And then teams just working from various different versions of the truth on projects, be that things like outdated fire risk assessments, to kind of old drawings that might not reflect what your buildings actually look like today. And most importantly, the kind of overarching thing I see over this is that most of these problems aren't like technology failures. It's not because people don't have the right software platform. It's generally just like where process falls down. And that distinction matters enormously. I had a lovely slide with my face on it, and I forgot to switch to it. So in terms of what we're going to go through, we'll be talking through what the golden thread actually means in practice, then going through where information management commonly breaks down on projects, what regulatory bodies might expect from block managers, managing agents, and the teams dealing with residential occupied buildings, going through how having a good information management system can reduce your operational risk on buildings and reduce risk in compliance. And I'll also walk through a live case study and finish with some practical actions that block managers and managing agents can ideally take immediately. Tell me if you can hear lots of background noise, by the way. The neighbour to our building is doing some scaffolding works at the moment, and it is very loud, but I'm hoping my computer has blurred it all out. So the big question often is like, what is the golden thread? Because in and of itself, this term doesn't mean very much. And it's often, I kind of hear it discussed as though the golden thread is like a software platform, or as though it's like having a fancy BIM model with all your data in it, or as though it's just like a big giant document repository. but it's not really any of those things. The golden thread is it's not like a big data set. It's basically evidence of control of the particular buildings that you're managing or you're operating. And the golden thread is really asking questions like, can you evidence the decisions you're making? Can you quickly find the latest fire strategy on the building? Can you evidence the current state of your building? Can you prove who approved potential changes, like, for example, changes in evacuation strategy? Can you evidence that your life safety systems are maintained? So it's really about these kind of very, very practical, kind of ongoing governance questions that make it easier and simpler and more robust and kind of lower risk to manage your buildings. I'll start going into a little bit in what bad information looks like, but to start with what good information looks like. There's some key principles here from a very good document prepared by the Construction Leadership Council called Delivering the Golden Thread that is from 2024. And some of these principles I think sound really obvious. Like you'll read this list and be like, well, of course my information needs to be all of those things. But what I see, and certainly I think what some of my clients find, is that a lot of these things are actually really hard in practice to maintain consistently over a life of a building, where your resident mix is changing and construction works might be happening to the building and risk assessments are going to change over time. But the core principles is that your information needs to be accurate, which again might sound obvious. It needs to be accessible. So does everyone actually know where to find your latest fire risk assessment, for example? It needs to be understandable, so written in a way that the people who are going to read the documents can actually easily understand what this information is trying to tell them. There's no good if it's using like a ton of very technical industry jargon, but doesn't just tell you in plain terms what the evacuation strategy of your building should be. It needs to be up to date, so you need to make sure that you're always working from the latest information. Needs to be secure because often we're dealing with kind of quite sensitive information, particularly when you're looking at things like PEEPs and data on vulnerable residents and so on. And it needs to be accountable. Someone needs to be taking kind of the responsibility for maintaining those systems. And more importantly, above all of this, more information does not automatically mean better information. Some of my clients have like 10 different filing cabinets of like original building plans and documents and every fire risk assessment ever done for their building. And that's great that they have all of that, but sometimes they're kind of drowning in information and documents while still finding it difficult to find the particular thing that you might need to make sure that you are compliant and the residents in your building are staying safe. So the key of all of this isn't just more documents, it's making sure that you've got the right information. Is it reliable? Is it usable? Uh, And a really key question is why are you all central to the golden thread? Why are managing agents, block managers actually at the core of all of this? Um, and I think the top line to say here is that you often are, whether or not you intend to be or possibly even want to be, because over time you will become the kind of the custodians and long-term holders of critical safety information. Block managers and managing agents are often kind of sitting in the center of coordinating multiple different parties, be that consultants, contractors, regulatory bodies, residents, and so on. A big point I see for across a lot of my clients is you may also find that you've inherited possibly very fragmented historic information from be that from kind of landlords, be it from freeholders, from like 4 big ring bound files that you might find in like the caretaker's office in the building. And often you end up picking up projects where through kind of just a chain of probably quite unfortunate things happening, most of the information may be lost. And this is a huge issue that a lot of my clients have. Um, and you're often also then the first party that is asked for information if there is an audit, if remediation kind of needs to take place, if there's a particular incident. And so you're often picking up information environments that you didn't actually create, and that's creating a massive, massive risk. Some of the possible red flags that we see with some of our So I'm really interested to hear in the comments kind of what all of your experience with these things are. But these are some of the kind of things that our clients see and we kind of see on the projects we're supporting our clients on. So lots of potential issues, but these are some of the patterns. Possibly kind of multiple versions of drawings or fire risk assessments circulating that might contradict each other, and nobody entirely knows what the latest thing is. So a project I'm working on at the moment, for example, had a lovely set of as-built drawings showing what had been built on site, but there were two sets of drawings for the foundations that completely contradicted each other. And nobody, including the original structural engineer from 25 odd years ago, had any idea which of those were built, which is clearly quite a fundamental issue. There's no clear latest approved information. Possibly things like fire strategies that don't reflect the current building. So, for example, one of my clients at the moment has discovered some kind of really fundamental risks with the structural frame of the building, which has automatically made their fire risk assessment out of date because it just doesn't take these into account. And so you end up with kind of different contradictory elements. Design changes not being formally recorded. So across a lot of my clients, this might be, for example, a penthouse level being built onto their building, but there's no real records of the change and of that happening. Information being stored across emails, across personal drives, as opposed to in a central location. Actions not being linked to current building information. And often a really big one is reliance on having one particular individual who just knows everything about the building, whether that's someone who's kind of in a head of risk role or in a compliance role or kind of a particular block manager. And that's a particularly tricky situation that we often see because eventually kind of people might leave, people's memories fade, and kind of one project just kind of fades into the background. And informal systems ultimately rely on kind of, they have a huge amount of risk. And hopefully, again, this kind of brings the point home that most failures that kind of we see across, I've got, goodness, upwards of 60 or 70 different kind of projects with different managing agents and so on at the moment across, 200 or 300 different blocks. Most of the failures that we're seeing here are not necessarily technology failures. It's much more about how information is governed. It's a bit of information on this slide here. But this is a little bit about how I see kind of the information management maturity journey looking. And different organizations can operate at different levels at the same time. So, for example, you may have one project that is highly controlled. You've got fantastic information on it, perhaps because the developer gave you a really good operation and maintenance manual at the end of construction. You've got an excellent block manager working on that who was like super on top of filing everything. But you may at the same time have another project which relies like super heavily on legacy knowledge, and the filing systems are much less good. But ultimately, the key is to kind of move through this information maturity journey, going from potentially fragmented information much more to managed information where decisions can be kind of fully traceable. The information that you've got on file is going to support operational safety for the building, for the residents. And you find it really easy, ideally, to kind of readily evidence information about the building should you go through a regulatory audit or a review, or have a consultant coming in on the project who starts, as I often do, asking all the really difficult questions and going, cool, where's your structural record information? Can you give me the original structural calculations? Can I have the latest test certificates for the ManSafe system so our team can go up on the roof? And you want to be in a place where, should someone come in and start asking those questions, you have all of that information to hand. A bit about how kind of this system often falls down. But I think it is also worth touching on some of the potential root causes behind this. Some kind of common potential failure points, although I dislike that word. But when projects struggle, when I see projects struggling, it's generally for something that falls into four potential categories. So either it's because information is just missing. There's no as-built records. So, for example, I'm dealing with 11 blocks at the moment in a central London location where The original developer went into into liquidation, sorry. The original contractor went into liquidation, and the building control body also went into liquidation. So my poor managing agent client that I am working with is, this building's only 6 years old, is dealing with this building where they just have incredibly limited as-built records because all of the entities who were involved in the original construction just don't exist anymore. So there's no one to go to for that information. That's obviously a slightly less common situation. They've been extremely unfortunate. But often, for example, your as-built records might be in a massive ring binder file in a caretaker's cupboard somewhere. Someone walks off with it one day and then suddenly your records are gone, which is not something anybody needs. Maybe things like incomplete fire strategies or FRAEWs, or just gaps, kind of in a more common sense, gaps in surveys or historical data. So you may have lots of very good data, but no one can find anything on the existing building structure. A second kind of potential way that things often kind of struggle is that the information exists, but it isn't usable. And this is a fairly big issue that we find. I'll come on to this in the case study I'll talk through in a little bit. But it may be that information is stored across multiple different systems and just as has a really poor structure or inconsistent naming. So on a remediation project I'm supporting a client on at the moment, I generally start off by saying, send me absolutely everything you can on the building. And I was sent by a WeTransfer link about 200 files that were basically just named 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So, you're looking for the fire strategy. How on earth do you find that? You've got to open 150 files. And that's really challenging for the people who are trying to manage and operate that building to try and find what it is that they need. Also, I've touched on this before, conflicting or outdated versions. Another big kind of root cause for issues is no single source of truth. So that might be working with outdated information. Something we often see there is, for example, kind of outdated fire risk assessments that just don't reflect the current mix of occupants in a building, for example, or may not reflect issues that have been flagged in a fire risk assessment for the external walls. And so it may lead someone to kind of you give a building or kind of keep a building in an evacuation strategy that really isn't the safest for the residents just because someone hasn't looked at the latest version of a document. And probably the biggest issue we see is change control. Whether that's that, some design changes happened over the course of construction, but they weren't recorded, they weren't approved, which is something I've seen on a project I'm working on up north at the moment, where the contractor has made a design change whilst this building is on site, but they didn't provide us with any drawings to evidence this. And so it means that the golden thread almost at this stage needs to be backdated so that at the end of the project, the client and the managing agent has a full understanding of, what actually is in our building, what products have we got, what potential risks might we face. Or as built that diverge from the design intent. So in the very fun example I have where there's 2 different foundation designs to this residential high-risk building, which is not an ideal situation at all. And these things are an issue because you'll all know buildings evolve constantly. A building is not just kind of a static thing that is there. It changes from, value engineering over construction stages, site discoveries, the risk to kind of residents changing, risk of vulnerable persons in the building changing, but we're all dealing here in an environment with a kind of constantly moving situation, which is a real challenge. My least fun slide is what happens when it goes wrong. And this really is where information management stops becoming this administrative thing that everyone has to do in the background and really becomes a core part of business strategy and business continuity strategy. So poor information management can create a really kind of hefty compliance risk, and failures can result in pretty severe issues. Life safety risks. So for example, like some of the examples I've touched on before, you may end up with unsafe evacuation strategies, kind of having real red flags raised in fire risk assessments, or things as kind of seemingly simple as life critical systems not being maintained because nobody can find the maintenance records, doesn't know when the next scheduled maintenance is. And that can be anything from probably the biggest thing I see is AOVs not being maintained because people just don't have an understanding of what needs doing because that isn't there on file. But also things like lightning protection systems, massive systems on the roof. And in order to manage these risks, you obviously have to know what risks you have to manage. You can't manage something that you don't have knowledge of. Um, Another kind of key issue is potential gateway delays. So incomplete records can delay building control approvals, or if you've got a higher risk building, delays to gateway 2 and 3 approvals. And in some circumstances, if you've got a project on site, can actually halt construction because it kind of runs the risk of them coming into something on site, kind of encountering a situation that because there weren't appropriate records, people didn't know that this was a potential risk, so couldn't mitigate against it. Potential financial risks through increased costs, through rework, or through doing things like ill-informed refurb and alterations because you don't have a full understanding of the building and how it operates. And then also insurance and asset risks. So not having the appropriate information on the buildings in the right place can impact things like lending, the ability to kind of maintain insurances, asset value, and so on. I did say that this was my least slide. So I've got a quick audience question, and hopefully this works. So I'm gonna have to move on to a different slide. But if you are you all able to scan this dot here? Oh, another sec to scan it. Here we go. Hopefully you can all see this, but this is the responses from everyone coming in real time. Yeah, it's always really interesting to see this. Huge kudos to the person who said their information is complete and well structured, and I would love to hear from you afterwards. It would be so good to hear what it is that you're doing. But all of these responses make complete sense, and I very much appreciate everyone's honesty. I think they're kind of the most popular response here at the moment, which is that you're finding it's fragmented across multiple systems. That very much reflects what I am seeing with the clients that I work with as well. Often they have great information, but it is fragmented. Not everybody in the organization has a complete picture of how their building is operating. And it's a really challenging position to be in here. Hopefully everyone who wanted to scan the code could. If you didn't scan the code instantly, there is a little participation link at the top. Unfortunately, I can't share two screens simultaneously. I'll give this another minute here. These are some really interesting responses. And if anyone wants to put any comments in the box that we can talk through at the end, there's going to hopefully be some time for Q&A. We can go through it there. Mostly there, but hard to navigate, kind of going up a little bit as well. Yeah, this very much reflects what I see across the client body that I work with. Right, I am going to skip back onto my slides again. Thank you so much all for responding to that one. And I'll coordinate with Vicky and I'll kind of share the screenshots of that as well once we've got all of the responses in, because I think it's helpful for everyone to understand that kind of the environment that we're all operating in. And it's really clear from that, as well as obviously kind of the client portfolio I work with, that this is very much a challenge across the whole of the built environment industry. This isn't something that's kind of unique to any block manager, managing agent, consultant, developer. Managing information and how we manage information in our buildings is a really, really challenging environment that everyone's working in here. Brilliant. So I've just re-shared my slides. Hopefully you can see those again. Something that I think I won't stay on this in depth, but it's impossible to do this presentation without mentioning the Building Safety Act. Because the Building Safety Act fundamentally changed expectations in the industry around information and how it is managed. Oops, I've just gone off that one. Bear with me. There we go. That's back. And importantly as well, that it essentially kind of distributes responsibilities across multiple duty holders. So don't worry, I'm not going to talk for long about the Building Safety Act because I'm sure you all hear about it all the time. But in kind of summary, I think I'm teaching you to suck eggs, but the Building Safety Act is a UK law that improves building safety, improves the standard of buildings, in particular higher risk buildings, but it does relate to all buildings. Building safety regulator, it imposes new duties on duty holders, which include kind of owners, managing agents, designers, contractors. And one of those key duties is to create and manage and maintain a golden thread of digital information on buildings. So as you can see, these two things kind of go hand in hand. You can't talk about one without the other. There's obviously loads of challenges here, many of which are what we've talked about a couple of slides ago. But the key here is that regardless of the fact that there's obviously overlap between different duties, information moves between different parties, but accountability needs to maintain kind of if like a traceability throughout. So the golden thread is kind of both a compliance exercise, but also a mechanism for how we demonstrate control of our building safety. Don't worry, that was pretty much all I had to say on the Building Safety Act. But I'm very, very happy to take questions on that one at the end. It's important then, I think, to touch on what information requirements look like. And the Building Safety Act doesn't just require information in the general sense, it requires traceability of information. And we are also seeing, and this may be something you're all noticing as well, that increasingly this is applying more to mid-rise buildings, to low-rise buildings, as well as just to higher risk buildings. So they were kind of top of the priority list for kind of obvious reasons, because that is where a lot of the risk lies, should there be failures in information. But building control bodies, when we're putting in applications on behalf of our clients for work to mid-rise buildings, we're starting to get asked exactly the same questions as they would ask for high risk buildings about, can you demonstrate that this isn't going to have an adverse effect on the structural stability of the building? Can you demonstrate how safety is going to be maintained given vulnerable occupant mixes? And so on. And it's very interesting to see that filtering down through the industry. So it's more and more important for us and for our clients to be able to demonstrate information. And the regulator and building control bodies are increasingly wanting to understand who's made particular decisions, basis for them making that decision is, what information did they use to make that decision. So, you know, at a very basic level, something we had a conversation with building control on recently for a mid-rise building we're supporting a block manager client with remediation to is, you're putting a slightly heavier facade system back on after you take off the old combustible facade system. How do you know that it is okay to put a slightly heavier system back on? Who made that decision? Were they a chartered structural engineer? What were their qualifications? How have you checked on what information that the building has the stability to take a slightly heavier system? And obviously, we need quite a lot of information about the building in order to be able to actually show you that that proper audit trail has been gone through. So it's effectively asking, can you demonstrate that how you operate the building or how you've designed changes to the building is kind of controlled? Is it properly evidenced? One more question. This is the last. I've only got two little polls in here. So I figured I'd do it while you've all got your phones still out. But I'll give you a moment to scan this. So this question is very much about kind of what actually creates the biggest challenge in your organization when it comes to managing information. Like, are we talking about technology? Is it legacy records, resourcing, change control, how you coordinate your consultants? Oh, So hopefully you can see that all okay. This gives me a nice break to have a sip of water as well, because it may not be as hot as it was last week, but it's still hot. If you put in other, feel free to use the chat box, which I will check at the end of the session. I think Vicky is checking throughout to make any comments if there's anything you want to add to any of this. This will really help with the discussion. Yeah, keeping information up to date is such a huge point that we see across all of the buildings we're supporting our clients on. Because we are operating in such a kind of non-static environment. Mm. Yeah, and the clear ownership one is a really interesting point as well. Um, in that, like in almost all the projects I work with, actually, there isn't at the outset typically a clear hierarchy of who is expected to kind of take ownership of updating and managing and filing and logging actions against each piece of information. And that it's a really challenging point. Perfect. I can see the responses have slowed a little bit, so I will flick back onto my slides again in one moment. Um, but this very much mirrors the kind of challenges that I see my clients facing. Information spread across systems is a really interesting point as well. And again, if anyone's happy to add some more information in the kind of comment box or add some questions at the end, I'd be really interested to see kind of how that is actually affecting you, whether you've managed to find systems that kind of talk to each other in an interface. Some of our clients have, some haven't. A lot of that comes down to having, I'm not an IT person, very at all. As you can probably see by my my slightly clunky use of Zoom. But I found on a lot of my projects that lots of things can be solved by getting the IT people talking to each other. So on the projects I'll talk through in the case study, where we supported a client in managing compliance across 179 residential blocks, so a huge program of work. The first thing I did was to get our head of IT to talk to their head of IT and go, what systems do you use? What systems do we use? Brilliant. How can we make them talk to each other? And those kind of conversations can be immensely valuable. Thank you so much again to everyone who responded on that one. Um, so I'd tried to have a stab at predicting the kind of things that people might talk about in that. Fortunately, I think I got it relatively right. But the issue very much here is that kind of this is really complicated ultimately. Buildings are just incredibly hard to manage. Um, like construction, building safety in general are just they're huge and very, very knotty fields where you are managing buildings where you have kind of complicated regulatory environments, massive volumes of data, huge and very kind of fast changing in some cases, residents, people who live in the blocks. When you're working with consultants, you might have like multiple disciplines, overlapping responsibilities. And so the problem is kind of in part complexity, but in part the fact that often there's just not the systems in place to actually manage that complexity. And ultimately, people are doing their best, right? And when information gets fragmented, people will improvise because we sometimes just are put under pressure and kind of need to respond to questions from residents, and assumptions may potentially become evidence, and risk just becomes very buried in all of this. So, in terms of why this is a risk, and I will go through that relatively swiftly. Kind of ultimately, if you have kind of managed complexity, you've got a single source of truth, you have the ability to make decisions in a very controlled way, and you have the ability to kind of control change. So ultimately, we've talked a lot about all of the challenges here, but information management is a way to turn this vast complexity in the environment we're operating in into control. Have a way to remove conflicting versions, have a way to ensure your team's working from the same information, have a way to kind of version control and audit control, and actually align how you manage your buildings with how the building is built. So I'm going to talk a little bit about information management standards then, which is everyone's favorite bit, and what good information looks like in practice. I love Lego. So I like visualizing this in my head in terms of Lego. You've got the instruction manual and you start with kind of this vast, complex array of pieces. And then through kind of instructions, through teamwork, through collaboration, we end up turning that complexity into something that ideally resembles what the instructions resembled. I'm good at Lego, so it generally does. I don't know how many of you have come across the ISO 19650 framework. I will not bore you with the details. I'm an information management nerd, but I do not expect everybody to be. But in short, there are standards that kind of define this, but what good information really comes down to is actually surprisingly simple. It basically means everyone knows where the information lives, everyone is working from the current version, changes are properly tracked, decisions can be evidenced later. It's actually at its core. Obviously, the doing it is very complicated, but what we're looking for, what good looks for in practice, good looks like in practice, is at its core very simple. And there's lots of different formal industry standards that support this approach. And a big one is ISO 19650, which is essentially a document management, information management standards that sets out things like how revision control is managed, how approval workflows are managed, how document naming is managed. This is what we do as a practice. We kind of work on all of our clients' projects in line with ISO 19650. There are other standards out there. But the important thing here is obviously not like memorizing standards terminology. The important thing is having some form of a framework in place to actually manage control. So some form of a way to manage file naming, to manage revision control, to manage approval processes, and to manage how standardized workflows run. So all of those can sound a bit administrative, but ultimately they're safety and risk controls in a way that they reduce conflicting information, they reduce the risk of undocumented decisions taking place, and they reduce the risk of uncontrolled changes. And ultimately, good information management should basically just reduce that ambiguity. You should be in a place where you understand how your building is operating and how it should operate at any time rather than basically guessing, which is obviously a massive risk. So I would say here, obviously, we use one particular framework to manage this, and I've got a couple of slides in a few slides' time which will show that. But there's not one right way to do this. Ultimately, the important thing is finding a system where everyone is working to the same agreed structure and everybody understands what it is that they need to do to maintain that compliance. So I'm going to go into a little case study. I'm conscious of time because I talk too much. So I will be moderately brief. This is a little bit of kind of where this theory becomes real. So we were appointed by one of our clients who is a social housing landlord to manage building safety across this massive program of 179 mid-rise blocks. And each of these blocks has probably minimum 10, 12 residential apartments in them. So we're talking a vast number of properties, a vast number of premises, vast amount of data, as you can imagine. So kind of thousands of historic fire safety actions on this with multiple consultants who'd been involved in the past, multiple contractors, huge amounts of inherited information. And this is very much as housing landlords are doing their absolute utmost to support the safety of these buildings. And importantly here, the challenge wasn't just kind of, how do we technically remediate these buildings? Oh, for context, which is very important, our particular commission was basically to support the client in they'd had fire risk assessments done on all of these 179 buildings, huge number of actions that were flagged in these fire risk assessments, from replacing fire doors, fixing issues with doors, installing fire alarm systems, non-slip stair nosing, no smoking signage, removing rubbish and prams from halls, loft compartmentation. So kind of this vast program of works to these occupied residential buildings. But on a program like this, it became very clear very soon to our team that the challenge isn't just kind of the technical remediation, and specify a new fire door to replace the old one which has kind of been damaged. The challenge here was understanding the basis for like what the baseline information was for these buildings. So what are the fire strategies? How are these buildings supposed to operate? What's defined the fire risk assessment actions? Can we see the maintenance records to understand how things have been maintained? What's the mix of residents that we can understand particular vulnerabilities or accessibility needs? What products have you got there at the moment? Because those fire doors might be fine. It might not have a label, but you might have a certificate. Um, and ultimately, the huge amount of the risk on this program sat in the fact that there was just very fragmented information on this project. This is was really challenging to consolidate all of the critical fire safety information, resident maintenance records into a single source of truth that our team could use to reduce the risk to the residents in these buildings and also to reduce the risk to the client should something go wrong. So at the outset, we requested a huge amount of information inputs or surveys. And for those of you who are working with consultants on any projects to your buildings, this is probably very similar to the kind of things you'll be asked for by your consultants. We would ask for the existing building information. So can we see the as-built? There were no as-built. Can we see the O&Ms? There were no O&Ms. Can we see historic work records? These were very much scattered across 1,000,001 emails from their internal maintenance team. What health, safety, and hazard information do you have about these buildings? And these were logged with an entirely different team inside the client organization. So the first step was to kind of talk to all the different teams, gather all of that information together, sort it by building, understand what we were working with. Second step here is to ask for the fire and life safety information. So copies of all the fire risk assessments, which had action trackers in them, any fire risk assessments for the external walls, compartmentation information, and then information on the fire strategy. So how are these buildings supposed to operate in a fire? Where are the compartments supposed to be? How should residents behave in terms of evacuation strategies and so on? Gathering physical survey information. So in this particular program of works, there wasn't any that could be found. So we identified that as a gap and our building surveyors carried those out. But the sorts of things we'd be asking for are intrusive surveys, facade investigations, structural checks, very much depends on the project. And then fourth, and really important, I think this one is often overlooked, is understanding the actual operational constraints and resident constraints. So how are residents communicated with? What's the occupation patterns? Like, are some of these buildings subtenanted? If they are, do we know who's living in them? Are they void? Are there people here with particular vulnerabilities who we need to be sensitive to? Are there access constraints? And on this program of work, this was a huge kind of challenge that we had to go through. I won't go through these in detail, but these will be in the slides for later. This was one of the lists I sent to the client of the information that we asked for from the outset. So I thought this might be a little interesting thing for you to all see when you get slides. So we've obviously now at this point, we've asked the client for information to try and establish the baseline. And we were in a situation where we had to then basically gather together all of these different data sets. One particular data set didn't tell us the whole story, and we needed to coordinate technical information, operational realities of the buildings, resident impacts, evolving site discoveries, sites. And often we found some of those new surveys completely contradicted historic assumptions. So on a program like this, as I'm sure a lot of you have found, information management basically becomes this like ongoing live process. It's not a one-off exercise of get the information into one place and then like happy days. So what we introduced to support the client wasn't basically like digitalization for its own sake. We introduced a filing system which looked to bring everything together into a consolidated environment to reduce ambiguity, reduce conflicting information, and basically improve the traceability. So this was the kind of stuff we were given at the beginning. Some asbestos surveys, some fire door inspections, all from different bodies. Some FRAs that were done in 2023. We were sent some more that were done in 2025. Another consultant long time ago had scoped some actions on the basis of them. There were old kind of QA reports from historic maintenance. So the big action at the start was bringing that all together so that we could understand and inform the client, what do they have? What are you working with here? What are the potential risks? How can we support you in mitigating those? So these are some of the issues we had. We had loads of information, it just wasn't controlled. And what we then supported the client with was bringing this all together in a centralized information management method, and I'll show you a bit of that in a moment, defining approval workflows, putting in place some structured naming and revision controls so that at the end of the project, the client gets back a more collated and kind of easy to manage set of information than they had at the outset. Supported them through use of a kind of a separate platform of linked risk and action tracking, so that they can then kind of take on any further FRA actions and putting in place formal change control. So here's a little bit of what this ends up looking like at the outset. This program is still ongoing. But for example, for a block, I'll take that Alpha Road one as a nice example, where at the beginning of the project, we were given from kind of collated from multiple different teams, kind of past maintenance records, vulnerable resident information, an old FRA, a new FRA, another FRAW. All of that was used and the information synthesized. And at the end of the project, the client is going to get a much more collated piece of information back to go into their own information management system, looking at sets of drawings for what was done on site, what products were put in place, all of their product information. So they've got full kind of data sheets and management information on hatches, fire doors, cupboards, and so on. Certificates, guarantees, and reports. So for access panels, the training and accreditation records for the people who put those in, riser information, and so on. Information on residual risks, specs, clients' reports, and inspections. So this is a way that we've kind of taken very, very, very dispersed information and have packaged it into a golden thread. And here on this particular program, there's a separate golden thread for each of these 179 blocks. So the outcome of this information management process was, it was not just compliance. It's kind of improved the client's operational confidence, essentially. And in getting back this collated set of information, clients have been able to retrieve the information faster, better understand the current status of their buildings, and evidence decisions more effectively. Essentially, as the landlord, they are getting constant questions from the residents in the block about management of fire doors and what they should do in the instance of a fire and where they can store their waste and where can we keep our bins, all of the kind of stuff that you deal with on the day to day. And with this information, it's been really interesting to see how they have actually been able to kind of make that decision faster because they have the information there in order to make the decisions. So this is very much ongoing, this program. But from starting with 1,812 fire risk assessment actions across 179 blocks, now 26 of the blocks have been fully remediated, and we will be handing back the client 1,763 different pieces of very, very carefully tracked and consolidated and audited records for their own compliance record to support in approved auditability going forwards. And here's a little diagram, which I will not talk through in detail because I'm conscious of time, of what that process might look like from kind of the client holding the baseline, building data, giving info to the project team and having that gap analysis, using that gap analysis to design the remediation proposals, and then essentially handing that back to the client at the end. So it's very much a cyclical process. We're almost at the end, do not worry. So I'm conscious that I've talked through loads and loads of different things from kind of challenges in information management, why it's important, different ways that you can manage information. I'm obviously not going to kind of talk through, at least in this forum, like particular platforms and so on, because there are so many different ways to do it, and it has to kind of work with your how your organization operates. But I wanted to finish before we go into questions with 5 practical takeaways that I feel organizations can kind of realistically act on. So the first one is making sure you've got a single source of truth. Um, and this, I think, will hopefully resonate given the responses from some of you in the poll earlier. And this is about having one platform, one set of structure, and no exceptions to that. Because if information is sitting in inboxes, it's sitting in personal drives, PDFs on desktops, then it isn't controlled. People can't find it and act on that information. The second is ownership. And again, I think a few of you picked up on this in the polls, but having particular named individuals responsible at each stage. Because if you've got something where everyone owns kind of management of a particular thing, no one really does. And that's where things end up falling through the cracks. Like one of the biggest causes of failure is just kind of ambiguity over who is supposed to act on a particular thing. The third then, and this is one of the biggest risk areas, is change control. Like you've all said before in the polls, buildings evolve constantly, products change, design changes, relative mixes change, and kind of making sure that all of those changes are reported and evidenced is absolutely vital. Fourth is then prioritizing, and again, this should be obvious, hopefully, is prioritizing life safety first. So if you've got a complicated system, do not try and fix everything simultaneously. You'll just end up in information paralysis. So start with the critical risks. Start with making sure that you've got a fire strategy and a way to make sure that's logged. Your compartmentation information to understand how the building is meant to compartment and then how it does in practice. Your fire risk assessments, maintenance of kind of critical life safety systems. These are the places for you to start. And then making sure as well that you just start somewhere. I think a lot of the organizations we work with feel a bit overwhelmed by like the scale of the Golden Thread Challenge and digitalizing information and kind of setting up these systems. But like you don't need to kind of solve everything overnight. You basically just need to start somewhere and look to move towards progressively more and more trustworthy information. So that will mean things like clear ownership, better control, confidence that people are working from the same sets of accurate and current information. And ultimately, here, the goal is not just, as I said at the start, having more information, it's having the right data to make safe decisions and have ultimately safer buildings.
Thanks,
Brilliant.
Abigail. Right, I'm just going to have a look and see what questions we've got here. Um, okay, we've got a couple. I think the first two seem to be quite similar, actually. So the first one's from Rajesh, which says, have you seen any other examples of utilizing digital storage for building information modeling, which I think you've sort of touched on slightly within the webinar already.
Yeah, so there's loads and loads of different potential solutions. And I think in terms of kind of obviously whatever solution you choose to use needs to kind of hit some of the key points. So it needs to be accessible by the right people. It needs to manage version control, needs to control kind of revisions and accessibility and who can change documents and so on. But we see our clients using so many different platforms from things like Autodesk Forma, which is what we use, all the way through to more simple systems like SharePoint. So there's very much no one size fits all. It is about
Yeah.
finding the right solution to meet each organization's needs.
Yeah, okay. I think there's only one more question here at the moment, which is pretty similar. Which yeah, is asking if you've got experience of any good or effective systems to manage the information. This person in particular has used SharePoint already, and Risk Flag. Yeah, they were just asking for more recommendations.
Mm, I don't know if I'd have any particular recommendations because it depends so much on what each person and organization needs.
Hmm.
Because it really has to kind of interface with all of the other systems. Um, they're very welcome to drop me a message. So if whoever asked that question wants to, I think my email address was probably on the last slide, but I assume Vicky, you'll share it
Yeah,
around.
I can share it.
Um, if you want to drop me a message, we can talk through like what your particular needs are, and I'll see if like all of my clients use a slightly different system, so I can talk through some of those options.
Yeah, it's quite tricky, isn't it, I guess, to recommend without seeing the portfolio and what's going on.
Very much.
Um, okay, someone else has asked, is it important to have a naming convention for documents, and how do you retrospectively do this?
Oh, with a lot of time and effort. Someone very nice in the admin team who you can buy cake for. It's really, really important to have a naming convention and names which kind of ideally identify kind of what party created the document, what the document is, gives it a unique name, gives it version control in it. So again, with this kind of thing, there's no one size fits all. We find us and a lot of other consultants use, and contractors as well, actually, use the ISO 19650 naming standard, which is basically a kind of series of like data fields almost that gives it its metadata. So it starts with like a unique identifier for the building or for the project, then an identifier for who created it, for what type of document it is, and so on. So that's really valuable. It's very much, that's probably the widest used document naming convention across the construction industry, certainly across the UK and Europe. So that's definitely worth looking into because it's kind of very transferable across different organizations. So a lot of the
Yeah,
time, working with a contractor, for example, who's producing information over the construction stage, they're then sending us information in exactly the same naming convention we are, which is the beauty of international standards. So it's definitely worth looking into that if you don't have a kind of naming standard you use already.
that's great. Okay, we've got another one here which says, how do you accurately cost up fees for a job like your case study, for example? And where once you start, you find it involves a lot of digging around for documents.
It's a really interesting question. And it is something that kind of we do have like challenges with on a lot of our projects as kind of someone who sits consultant side, that at the outset when we might be bidding for a job, we've got no idea how much record information
Mhm.
managing agent, block manager, client, freeholder, and so on holds, because at that point they often have absolutely no idea either. And so it really depends. That's a really hard question, actually. It depends on the relationship with the client. If it's someone we kind of have a very good relationship with, like one of our long-standing block manager clients, we would generally be very transparent at the outset and have that
Yeah.
conversation and say, we're working on the basis at the moment that you have X, Y, Z. But if
Mhm.
having to go through a kind of a weeks long process of commissioning measured surveys and kind of engaging with like trying to dig out details of the original consultant team who might have worked on this building 25 years ago, this is going to be our time charge basis, for example, for going out and seeking that information.
Yeah.
But it very much depends project to project. Some clients, particularly when I tender for work through kind of open market tenders, will want us to take that risk and just kind of absorb that cost. So
Hmm.
it's very much case by case. So, for example, on that kind of the case study project, um, I basically took a risk in the tender and just made an assumption on how much record information we thought they would have. Um, and they had less than I expected, and it took our team weeks of running around. But that became our risk. So that's if you're
Yeah.
to appoint a consultant on a project, I think that's a really valuable conversation to have with them at the outset, and for anybody.
Yeah. Just being really transparent from the beginning.
Very, very much.
Okay, that's great. Okay, there's another question here. It's a bit of a long one. Um, okay, so they've said it's slightly outside of the scope of today's session, but they're interested in how you have found the challenge of helping clients understand the golden thread. Only one part of the wider building safety regime. Many organisations focus on the digital information element, but do not always recognise the need for training, behavioural change, and operational maturity. What approaches have you found effective in helping clients adopt the full regime rather than seeing the golden thread as the end point? Does
Such
that
a
make sense?
it's a really good question. And it's often a bit of slow burner because it's kind of one thing for like the head of risk in a like a block management company, for example, to like understand that and understand the importance of it. But like, how do they then transfer that information down to like potentially hundreds of different block managers who are then the like boots on the ground managing everything on a day-to-day basis, but they are ultimately the people who are like creating and using the information. Um, I found that for quite a lot of our block management clients, we've offered basically bespoke training sessions. Um, so if we kind of notice that a client is having, or like block manager is having difficulties with kind of how they pass that information down internally, I've offered to come in and I've talked to all of their block managers. Because I suppose it's one thing for them to hear it from their head of risk, but it's another thing to have an external consultant stepping in and going, no, 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 this isn't just like someone in your organization giving you a tricky time. Like this is a really important regime change. So it very much depends, again, like client to client in terms of what's going to work for them. But yeah, the core of the question, I guess, touches on the fact that it is really, really difficult to build up that understanding. And I still work with kind of new clients who I seem to be a point for like when people hear about a difficult project, somebody out there seems to know, like, call Abigail. So the number of clients that are kind of block managers who I've got calls from who've gone, so and so told me to phone you because I'm having issues with building safety. Oh, I think that might have happened like 7 or 8 times just in the last few months. And it is really difficult because often then I'm the first person they've spoken to about, potentially having like unregistered higher risk buildings that they just don't understand what they need to do with. And it does become a really difficult piece of education to kind of have someone at the other end of the phone and go, like, no, this is what you need to do. This is the regulatory regime that this supports. These are the potential risks of not doing it. Because yeah, to whoever asked the question, you are right. There's a massive, massive education piece around this.
Thank you, Krish, for that question. I hope that helps. Okay, we'll have to finish up there, I'm afraid. But thank you, Abigail, so much for your time today and presenting. And thank you to everyone who's joined us. As I mentioned earlier, the webinar has been recorded. So if anyone would like to watch it back or share it with colleagues, it will be available on the News on the Block YouTube channel tomorrow. Otherwise, thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks, Abigail. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.